Welcome to this discussion of the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument is something that is mostly referred to in medieval philosophy, particularly in the work of Aquinas, and many students encounter it as though it had its origin in the medieval period. That, however, is blatantly not so. The cosmological argument has its origins in Plato and in Aristotle. First of all, in Plato. Now, what I want to do today is to go through the Platonic argument and then to go through the Aristotelian enhancement of that argument. But it has its source principally in Plato. In Plato, the essential idea is this. It's a very obvious observation. There are living things, and then there are non-living things. The living things are capable of their own movement. They move themselves. Perhaps not obviously so in the case of plants. They grow, but and apparently they can sometimes move about a little bit. But mostly what we're talking about here is animals. And animals are capable of their own movement, their own motion. Other things, like rocks, are not capable of their own movement. So, if you had, let's say, and this example comes from David Hume in the 18th century. Suppose you have a billiard table. Now, the billiard balls are inanimate objects. They can't just go flying about by themselves. They can't go into the corner pocket by themselves. They have to be moved. And they're moved by something which is living, which is capable of movement, of motion, self-movement. And that self-movement comes from the billiard player who, with a cue, strikes a ball, it bounces into other balls, etc. And eventually, say, the blue goes into the corner pocket. Okay. Now, the balls themselves are just simply inanimate objects, and they're set in motion by something which is capable of movement in itself. That creature is living. And the term that Plato uses for that life that it has is ensouled. So there is an ensouled creature, something which is capable of its own movement and of its own internal life, which moves other things like the billiard balls. Okay, that's the idea. Now, the thing which really struck the Greeks from very early on was what you might call the wheel of the heavens. At night, this is true in the daytime too, but at night what you see is the planets and the stars in a slow movement across the sky. It's slow so that we can't see it moving. If we were different creatures, like birds, we might be able to actually see it moving. They apparently have far better eyesight for movement than we do. We don't see the movement, but look on at one moment, check where the stars are, then in half an hour's time, they will have moved. Some stars will have set below the horizon. Some stars will have risen above the horizon. And thus, in that way, you see the movement of the stars. Now, that movement was a circular movement. You have the same movement with the moon and the sun across the sky. in the arc that is called the ecliptic. Now that movement is circular, and its axis seems to be on us. That's what struck the Greeks anyway. And that idea that you have this circular movement accorded with the idea that the circle, for Plato, was a perfect geometrical object, perfectly symmetrical, and in all of its respects, in all of the ways in which it could be continuously divided up, it was perfect. And so this had come down from the Pythagorean background of Plato, but Plato had imbibed this idea, and it was an entrenched part of the Greek visible world, that there was this astonishing circular motion in the heavens. What was making that motion? What was moving the wheel of the stars about this axis? Well, on the principle that we just saw, these stars look to be, by themselves, as a whole, inanimate. So what was moving them? Well, on the principle that we just saw, the only thing that could move them is something that is living, that is ensouled. And so Plato comes to the conclusion that there is something that makes the heavens move, and that makes all that we see move. This movement can only originate from something which is capable of movement itself. It has to originate, because you can trace suppose there were something that was also moving the stars, but which was not capable of movement itself. Then it would have to be moved by something else. And take that thing. What's moving it? Well, there is only one thing that can do that. If you trace this back in the chain of causes, you have to eventually come to, at some point, to something which moves of its own accord, of its own will. So it must be moving the heavens, moving things, but is not itself moved by other things which, as it were, precede it. Okay, that's the idea. Now, this was laid out by Plato in several, but principally two, late works. One was called, which may be the last work, one was called The Laws, Book 10 of the Laws, and the other was the Timaeus. And in both of these accounts, in the Timaeus, you get more detail on this. You get the argument in the Laws on how this all is, as it were, following the laws. You get the idea in the Laws, and you get the details in the Timaeus, where that mover of the heavens is what is called the demiurge, or demiurgos, the demiurge. The demiurge is producing the movement in the way in which we see it in the heavens. Just as we, subordinate creatures, subordinate ensouled creatures, move the billiard balls, throw rocks, do other things. So those are subordinate acts of souls, ensouled creatures, but the larger movement is provided by the demiurge. Now, one might object to this point that, of course, the Greeks were just wrong about this, that the heavens are not moving. That the wheel of the heavens, the wheel of the stars, as they rotate through the sky, this is not an actual motion, you might say. that there is something else which is moving, namely the Earth. All right, well, then you just simply restate the argument by stating what is causing the Earth to move. It's also moving in a circular motion, which gives rise to the illusion that the stars are rotating on an axis. They're not. They are. It's only the Earth that is moving, that is rotating. But that's enough to get the argument going again. Because then you ask, well, the Earth can't have started rotating itself unless it's an ensouled creature. And if it isn't an ensouled creature, if it can't move itself, then there has to be something which has got the Earth spinning. What is that? And there's more to it than that. I mean, it's not quite true that the heavens, as it were, are static. I mean, that's maybe a mistake that some people make at this point. It's not true that it's true that as it were, the rotation of the heavens is not due to the rotation of the heavens. It's due to the spinning of the Earth. That's true. But it's not true that there's nothing in the heavens that's moving. The planets have a movement which is against the movement of the stars, which is separate from the movement of the stars. So there's got to be something more going on there. But then, of course, there's the other things as well. There are things visible within our heavenly view, which are definitely moving. For example, the Andromeda galaxy, an entire galaxy of about the same size as ours, is heading towards our galaxy at a very rapid clip and will eventually collide directly into it. So the Andromeda galaxy is definitely moving, and there are other things that we can see that are also moving. So it's not true that the universe is static. And so for all of those things that are moving, one can again ask the question, well, they're not moving, as it were, by themselves, capable of their own movement. What has set them in motion? And the only thing that can set them in motion, like the billiard balls, is some kind of mover, something which moves of its own will. For Plato, the causation of all of this setting things in motion is not entirely clear. Plato doesn't have a very good grip on the notion of movement, of causation, of what puts things into motion, how things move. He's not so much an analyst of mechanical objects. One might say he's uninterested in these matters, and so what he gives in this at this point is not a particularly satisfactory account. And it is, in a sense, to meet that deficiency that we come to Aristotle. With Aristotle, we have, as it were, the beginnings of a theory of causation, of an elaborate theory of causation. And really, for the first time, we might say that this is one of Aristotle's great achievements, that he thinks that there is something missing in Plato and that it needs to be given. So what he is going to give is a theory of causation, which means a complete theory of what makes things so. Why do things happen? How do things happen? He's going to have an umbrella theory which tries to answer all of that. And it's a lot of sort of, as it were, separate questions which are going to get wrapped up in this theory, this elaborate theory, which is going to be laid out one book after another of Aristotle's to try to fill in this gap of what makes things change as they do. And that has to be a theory of causation. Now, Aristotle realizes that causation happens inside things. It's not just a case of things being unmoved and things moving. other things. It's a case that even within a single organism, there are things which are moving, which are active agents, as it were, and things which are unmoving. So if I am the billiard player and I knock the billiard balls into one another, which then cascades into the blue going into the corner, that act is, as it were, seems like it's all of me. But that's not how things are in the body. There are some things which are moved by other things, and other things which look like they're passive, or that they're somehow being caused efficiently by other processes in the body. And Aristotle was, perhaps in his principal interests, was a biologist. It's what many people don't realize about him. His principal vocation was biology, and he was particularly interested in marine biology. Now, his interest in biology comes from his father. His father was a physician, and to some extent he grew up in his early state of understanding the need for an appreciation of biological processes in healing, and also in just understanding how bodies work, how animals work, how plants work. He was interested in all of that. And that's not what one could say of Plato. Plato was not so much, well, not much at all, interested in the world of creatures and animals and things. He was interested in geometry, he was interested in mathematics, but the physical world of the animate world, all of that was really not Plato's central interest. Let's be very frank about that. Aristotle came along with a mind that was focused on other things. Son of a physician, not just a physician, a court physician, a man of eminence in the court of a prince, and therefore a man who had to spend his life gaining expertise. Now, he died when Aristotle was young, but he left Aristotle with these interests. Aristotle was not a geometer. I think one can say that. He was not a mathematician. He was not interested really in those things. No matter that he may have picked up some of them from his presence in the Platonic Academy for 20 years, beginning at a period when Plato was away initially, maybe away for many years before he came back into the academy. So Aristotle came into the academy and was in the academy for 20 years until Plato's death, roughly. And then he left and went off and formed and developed his own philosophy, which is, a direct embarkation from the Platonic philosophy, but in which he adds his own area of expertise and interest, and adds significantly to it. Now, what he adds in this question of cosmology, or the cosmological argument, realizes that a body is composed of a mixture. Some parts of the body, of the human body, are moved, and some are movable. Some self-move, some are willed. For example, here I'm moving this hand, and I can pick up this hand as an inanimate object with this hand. So this hand becomes the active hand, and this hand becomes passive, like it's a rock. So I can move parts of my body. I could lift my leg, not by lifting it, but by picking it up. You see? So you have this ability of the body to act as both mover and unmoved. Or not unmoved. Mover and, things that, as it were, need something else to move them, something which requires an external movement. And we have here again a chain of causes. How do the things which aren't capable of movement, how do they move in this process? What moves them? What is moving them? Well, in the case of in some cases it is where there are things which are moving themselves in the physical realm. But in the case of the heavens, we again have this, and this is the core of the cosmological argument, we have this chain of causes. What is moving the heavens? According to Aristotle, in his refinement of the cosmological argument, there must be something in the chain. When you go back in the chain of causes, you must finally reach something which in itself is unmoved. It is not being moved by anything, but it is moving that which comes before it, as it were, that which is before it in this chain. As we have gone back, we reach an unmoved mover. An unmoved mover. And that, according to Aristotle, must be the case, because you couldn't have an infinite chain. So if things are in motion, and these are inanimate things that can't move themselves, then there has to be a chain of causes going backwards in this argument. There must be a chain of causes to eventually reach something which is causing things, but which is not caused. And it has to stop somewhere, because you couldn't have an infinite chain of causes, because there would be nothing to, it would not have a beginning. It would not reach, as it were, any finite point that you come to. If it goes infinitely far back, then it takes infinitely long for it to get anywhere. How does it get to the point of moving the earth or moving the heavens? So, according to Aristotle, it's inconceivable that it should be infinite, and therefore there must be a finite beginning to it. Now, we might hesitate on that. We might say, well, there can be an infinite chain of causes, but the Greeks were very, very reluctant to postulate things that were infinite. Even the ordinary counting numbers, they didn't describe them as infinite. They described them as such that for any number you can add a number to it, and therefore you can add a number to that one, and therefore you can add a number to that. So there's a sort of potentiality of, well, you can always do this, you can always do that. In the case of the chain of causes, if you're chasing this chain backwards to one thing which is itself not capable of movement, back to another thing which is not capable of self-movement, to another thing which is not capable of self-movement, to another which is not capable of self-movement, unless you get at some point to something which is capable of moving something itself, something which is capable of moving things in this chain, the chain doesn't have a beginning. To say that it goes infinitely far back is just the same as saying, for the Greeks and perhaps for us, is the same as saying it can never begin. It does never begin. It goes infinitely far back, which means for any of these motions, there's an earlier motion which is itself an earlier motion and an earlier motion, etc. And it goes on forever. If it goes on forever, then there is no beginning to this. So there would be then no explanation for how this motion in the heavens comes to be. It's an extraordinary argument. It's a profound argument. Now, from this argument, we get the idea that there has to be at least one unmoved mover. At least one unmoved mover. Now, Aristotle identifies that as God. That may surprise you. It surprises many people. For Aristotle, this God in the singular is the unmoved mover in the cosmos. Many people don't expect that because they think of monotheism, which this seems to be, as a later biblical invention, that it only comes, as it were, in the Judaic-Christian tradition, or that it comes in the sort of a tradition which is centered in the Middle East, for example. You may say that Zoroastrianism early on is a monotheistic religion. But certainly it's often claimed that monotheism is not a Greek view. Well, here you seem to have something that starts in Plato, who often refers to, when he speaks of the self-moved mover, when he speaks of that, he speaks of it in the singular. He speaks of it as the king. That idea is in Aristotle as the unmoved mover is God. And that's 300 BC. Now this is sort of, I think, maybe the explanation for why in philosophical education in general, you get this strange idea that we can somehow block out this fact that you get the cosmological argument in Plato and in Aristotle and pretend that it is entirely a medieval and post-medieval, that it's an Islamic and Christian idea, and we find it expressed in St. Thomas Aquinas. That idea blocks out a whole aspect of its history, that it originates in Aristotle most clearly, and in Plato as well. But it's in Aristotle most clearly, and it's in Aristotle in its most detailed form. So Aristotle believes that there is a God, and that God is the originator of the things in the universe which can't have originated motion for themselves. They're even for the things which are capable of movement themselves, like human beings. They have to go back to processes. This is the biologist in Aristotle again. They have to go to processes of birth, in which there is no volition in them. They have to go back to an earlier volitionalist state. That has to come from God. Now, this really does upset, I think, a lot of the education about this subject, and it's something that you may spend a lot of time at university and never find out. Unless you have a specialized teacher in Aristotle, you're unlikely to ever learn this. And you can see, for example, the effect of this. If you go to Wikipedia and look at the cosmological argument, what you'll find is some very, very minor comments about Plato and Aristotle, but quickly moves on to the Christian basis of this, which it basically claims is sort of the real foundation of this. It's just not true. Wikipedia is, in so many ways in philosophy, utterly useless because it's so biased in many of the articles that are written in it. Philosophy is an argumentative subject, and if someone on one side of the argument takes hold of a Wikipedia article, then it ends up being appallingly biased, and this is the case with the cosmological argument. So to go and understand the cosmological argument, you really need to understand, certainly at least Aristotle, and probably looking at Aristotle, then look back towards Plato to see how he originated it in the Timaeus and in also in the Laws. I've said that there is one primary unmoved mover in Aristotle, and you may say, well, great, okay, he's a proto-Christian, you may say. Well, not quite, because he believes that there are also 55 subsidiary unmoved movers. 55 subsidiary unmoved movers. And what are they? Well, why are they necessary first? They are, it seems as though they are required because the motion of the planets are eccentric. They're not directly, can't be directly circular motions. There are retrograde motions. There are, let's face it, they have fancy motions. These fancy motions require fancy movers to put them into that motion, to resolve them into something like a genuine circular motion, which Aristotle takes over from Plato in thinking that that is the essential movement of the perfect geometrical object. So he's with this idea of a sort of circular movement of the planets. So he thinks that there are 55. So all in all, there are 56 unmoved movers for Aristotle. Where does that go into in Christianity in Aquinas? Well, maybe these others are angels. Maybe that's the whole origin of angels, because much of Christianity, of course, launched off from these beginnings. Plato and Aristotle passed through the Islamic period and then was resurfaced in the Western tradition in someone like Aquinas. And then you get all of this talk about angels and what these angels are doing. Not really present much in the Bible very much. And anyway, so maybe that's where they get reassimilated into the Bible, into Christianity, which allows there to be less conflict with Aristotle than might seem. Aristotle is, by the way, one of the principal motivators for Aquinas. Aquinas knew Aristotle well, and you might say that Aquinas is updating Aristotle for the purposes of medieval Christianity, and I think that's a fairly fair assessment of where he's at. So this is where we get to. Now, I think people have an unfair reading of the cosmological argument. Some people think that it's a good live argument, but I think that by and large they're often not treated very fairly in this tradition, because the cosmological argument is a very good argument. Part of this omission of Aristotle from all of this is that there is not much, maybe not one, proper analysis of Aristotle's own version of this cosmological argument. It seems to have been omitted, and there's not much appreciation of Plato either. I wouldn't quite say they've been censored out of this tradition, but they have been treated as inconvenient for the narrative, let's say. And so there's not much of them left. Not much in terms of making an intellectual contribution. And I suppose it's an embarrassment in some ways for Christianity that it has to go back to Aristotle on this matter. But nevertheless, it does. Now, the point is, I think, the cosmological argument is a very good argument. Now, there are things you can say against it. I'm not saying that it's perfect. There are things you can say against it. There are strategies you can take. But what it can't be is just simply roughly dismissed. It can't be brushed aside. And I think that there is a tendency by some people to think that one can do that, to think that one can just not take this whole thing seriously and brush it off and say, oh, cosmologists now know much more about the cosmos and we can do without that sort of thing. Can we? Really? How? Even suppose we trace it back, even suppose we trace the cosmos back to a Big Bang, and you say, well, it was all caused by the Big Bang. Sure. People are entitled to ask, well, how does that thing which causes everything thereafter, in which everything is set in motion, what sets it in motion? You may try to dismiss that as a question that you want not to be sensible, but it is a sensible question. And saying that it isn't sensible is not going to cut any ice. It's just dishonest. It's intellectual dishonesty to pretend that this in itself major argument is of no modern interest. I would say that that's just plain mistaken, arrogant and mistaken. It is of interest to us, and it requires an answer, an intelligent answer. I want to end just by reading you a passage from the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, since he gives a beautiful analogy to the cosmological argument, which brings out in a unique way some of its finer qualities. And I think in this form you might find it, the cosmological argument, even more convincing. Here is what Coleridge said. It was, again, for Coleridge, one of his dreams. Here is what Coleridge's dream said. The old man spoke in divers tongues and unfolded many mysteries, and among other strange things he talked about an infinite series of causes, which he explained to be a string of blind men, of which the last caught hold of the skirt of the one before him, he of the next, and so on till they were all out of sight, and that they all walked straight without making one false step. We inquired who there is at the head to guide them. He answered, no one, but that the string of blind men went on forever without a beginning. For though one blind man could not move without stumbling, yet that infinite blindness supplies the want of sight. I burst into laughter at this strange exposition and awoke. So the string of blind men, the infinite string, is meant to make all of them see well, to provide the sight, the guidance, whereas no one blind man would be able to see at all. It's a neat analogy. It's worth thinking about to understand the improbable or the seeming absurdity of asking for an infinite chain of causes that doesn't ever begin. Now, our universe seems to be not that. It seems to be a finite chain of causes. But given that it's a finite chain of causes, then the question reasserts itself. How did that first part, the first element in that chain, begin? How did it do it? And that is not a trivial question. It's a good, big philosophical question, not to be dismissed. Thank you.